Sometimes the heart finds love when it has given up looking for it. For Haldor the blacksmith, 53 years old and weathered by life's storms, that moment came on an ordinary morning by the sea. He stood on the dock, waiting for an arranged bride, some young woman the village elders had chosen to secure his bloodline. His warrior days were long behind him. Now his hands shaped metal instead of wielding swords. When the Longship appeared, he expected to meet a frightened girl needing protection. What stepped off that ship was Brynja, a towering Shieldmaiden in full armor who had buried 2 husbands and carried battle scars deeper than his own. She wasn't looking to be saved or tamed, but sometimes 2 broken people can heal each other in ways they never imagined. What happens when a lonely blacksmith meets a warrior woman who refuses to bow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade. Haldor Eriksson stood at his forge, the familiar weight of his father's hammer in his calloused hands. The iron glowed cherry red in the coals, malleable and ready to be shaped. Much like his life had been hammered into something entirely different from what it once was. 10 years ago, his name had struck fear into Saxon hearts. The Wolf of the Northern Seas, they'd called him, leading raids that brought glory and gold to his clan. Now, at 53, his hair had turned the color of winter ash, and his hands, once steady on sword and shield, found their purpose in gentler work, horseshoes instead of helmets, plowshares instead of spearheads. The village of Ravenshollow had been his sanctuary and his prison, nestled between towering cliffs and the restless sea. It was a place where old warriors came to die quietly, where the younger generation looked upon their elders with a mixture of respect and pity. The great hall that once echoed with victory. Songs now hosted discussions about harvest yields and fishing rights. You cannot live forever in the shadow of what was Haldor. Elder Grim had told him just 3 days prior, his weathered face creased with concern. The bloodline of Eriksson cannot end with you. Your father's name deserves to continue. Haldor had listened in silence, knowing this conversation had been inevitable. The village elders had been patient, perhaps too patient, but duty was duty. In a world where family lines meant everything, a warrior without heirs was a tree without roots. There is a clan across the Whale Road, Grim had continued, spreading a worn piece of parchment across the wooden table. The Ironburn of the Eastern Isles. They have a daughter of marriageable age. The arrangement would benefit both our peoples. The arrangement, not love, not choice arrangement. Like negotiating the price of grain or the terms of a trade agreement. Yet Haldor had nodded his agreement, because what else could he do? At his age, with his reputation, what woman would choose him freely? The forge fire crackled, bringing him back to the present moment. He worked the iron with practiced strokes, each blow of the hammer echoing across the small courtyard behind his stone house. The rhythm was meditative, helping him forget the endless questions that plagued his nights. What did she look like? This bride-to-be? Was she frightened? Did she know about his past, the blood on his hands, the villages he'd burned, the men he'd killed in the name of glory and gold? Haldor! The voice belonged to Born the fisherman, a man whose loyalty had never wavered through all these years of exile. The ship approaches! The hammer stilled in Haldor's grip. Today, after months of waiting, wondering, and preparing, today his life would change again. He set down his tools and walked to the small window that faced the sea. There, cutting through the morning haze, was a longship with a red and gold sail, the colors of the Ironburn clan. His stomach tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Nervousness? Anticipation? Dread? Perhaps all three, twisted together like rope fibers. He reached for the ceremonial wedding cloak, hanging from a peg near the door, rich blue wool lined with fox fur. a garment that had belonged to his father and his father's father. It felt heavier than chainmail as he draped it across his broad shoulders. The village had gathered at the harbor, their faces filled with curiosity and barely concealed excitement. It had been years since anything this momentous had happened in Ravenshollow. Young mothers held their children up for a better view, while the men discussed what they knew of the Ironborn clan in hushed, respectful tones. "She be young," whispered Astrid the Weaver, her eyes bright with gossip. "Pretty, too, I'd wager. The Ironborn are known for their fair daughters. What does she know of our Haldor?" wondered Olaf the baker, kneading his hands nervously. "Will she accept his past, do you think?" Haldor tried to block out their speculations as he made his way through the crowd. Each step felt weighted with expectation, not just his own, but the entire village's. They wanted this to work, needed it to work, because his happiness had somehow become bound up with their own sense of hope and renewal. The Longship drew closer, and he could make out figures moving on deck. His heart hammered against his ribs, like a caged bird. What words would he say? How did one greet a bride arranged by others, chosen by necessity rather than affection? The formalities seemed suddenly absurd. Empty gestures that could never bridge the chasm between strangers. Elder Grimm appeared at his shoulder, his presence both comforting and oppressive. "Remember, son, she comes here seeking security and family. You can provide both. The rest, affection, understanding, these things can grow with time." Could they? Haldor wasn't so sure. Love wasn't iron that could be heated and shaped according to will. It was more like the sea, wild, unpredictable, following currents that no man could map or control. But he nodded anyway, because what choice did he have now? The Longship's hull scraped against the wooden dock with a sound like grinding teeth. Sailors called out in voices rough from wind and salt water, securing ropes and adjusting the sail. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. A figure emerged from the ship's cabin, and Haldor's breath caught in his throat. This was not what he had expected, not at all. The woman who stepped onto the dock was not young, not fragile, not seeking protection from a harsh world. She was tall, perhaps even taller than himself, with shoulders broader than many warriors he'd known. Her hair was the color of burnished copper, braided with silver rings and beads that caught the morning light. But it was her eyes that stopped. Him cold, pale blue like winter ice, direct and unflinching, taking his measure as surely as he was taking hers. She wore mail beneath a traveling cloak, and at her side hung a sword that showed signs of use. This was no sheltered maiden seeking a husband's protection. This was a Shieldmaiden, a woman who had chosen the warrior's path and survived to tell the tale. Their eyes met across the distance of the dock, and in that moment, Haldor realized that everything he thought he knew about this arrangement was wrong. The village fell silent around them, sensing that they were witnessing something unexpected, something that would change the careful plans they'd all made. The woman, his bride-to-be, inclined her head in acknowledgement but did not bow. Her stance was that of someone accustomed to command, to respect earned through strength rather than granted through deference. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, and Haldor found himself wondering if the gods were playing some elaborate jest upon him. "You are Haldor Eriksson," she said, her voice carrying easily across the water. It wasn't a question. "I am," he replied, his own voice rougher than he'd intended. She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. Then, without another word, she began walking toward him, her boots ringing against the wooden planks with the measured cadence of a warrior, approaching either battle or destiny. Everything Haldor had prepared himself for, the shy glances, the awkward courtesies, the gentle guidance of an inexperienced girl, crumbled like sand before this woman's steady approach. Whatever came next, it would not be the quiet, Predictable marriage, he'd resigned himself to Dot. It would be something else entirely. "I am Brynja, Thor's daughter," the woman announced as she reached the end of the dock. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time she spoke. "Daughter of Thor Ironside, twice widowed, and sent here on a matter of mutual benefit." The formal introduction hung in the salt-tinged air like a challenge. Around them, the villagers shifted uncomfortably, their romantic notions of a blushing bride dissolving like morning mist. This woman spoke of marriage as she might discuss terms of trade, practical, straightforward, without pretense. Haldor felt the weight of his ceremonial cloak, suddenly aware of how foolish he must look in his finery. He dressed for a ceremony, not a negotiation. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," he managed, his voice steadier than his thoughts. I know who you are." Brynja's pale eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "The Wolf of the Northern Seas. Your reputation crossed the water long before I did." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. Some had nearly forgotten Haldor's wartime epithet, preferring to think of him as their quiet blacksmith. To hear it spoken aloud by this imposing woman was like watching a ghost materialize in broad daylight. "That was another life," Haldor said carefully. "Was it?" Brynja tilted her head, and he caught sight of a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, thin, precise, the mark of a blade that had come far too close. "Men like us don't simply shed our skins like snakes. We carry our choices with us, in our scars and in our sleep." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Haldor's nights were indeed haunted by memories he couldn't escape. The faces of men who'd fallen to his sword, the sound of burning thatch, the weight of decisions that had seemed right in the moment but festered like infected wounds in hindsight. "Elder." Grim cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should retire to the hall for the formal ceremonies. There's much to discuss, and I'll need to see his forge first." Brynja interrupted, shouldering a travel pack that looked as though it could provision a small army and his home. "If we're to live together, I should know what manner of life he leads." The request, or perhaps command, sent another ripple of surprise through the crowd. Brides were typically welcomed with feasts and ceremony, not property inspections. But Brynja moved past the gathered villagers with the confidence of someone who'd never asked permission for anything in her life. Haldor found himself walking beside her, matching her long stride as they made their way up the path from the harbor. Her battle shield was strapped across her back, its surface bearing the scars and dents of countless encounters. Unlike decorative pieces carried for show, this shield had clearly saved its bearer's life more than once. "You have children?" she asked without preamble. "No." "Good. Nor do I. Dead husbands leave widows, not mothers." The matter-of-fact delivery of such a stark statement made Haldor glance at her profile. There was no self-pity in her expression, no invitation for sympathy. It was simply truth, spoken as one might comment on the weather. "How did—" he began, then stopped himself. Such questions were too personal, too soon. How did they die? Brynja finished for him. The first fell to Saxon steel at Stamford Bridge. The second took fever after a raid went badly. Both were good men, but the gods had other plans for their thread in the tapestry. They'd reached his forge, and she stopped to examine the setup with a critical eye. Her gaze took in the bellows, the anvil, the neat arrangement of tools hanging from wooden pegs. She picked up his father's hammer, testing its weight and balance with the familiarity of someone who understood the craft. "Well made," she pronounced, setting it back in its place. "You keep good tools." A man's smithy tells you much about his character. What does mine tell you? That you value function over appearance, that you work alone but take pride in the Thayin, work itself, that you found peace in creation after years of destruction. She met his eyes directly. "These are not bad things in a husband." The casual way she spoke of their impending marriage sent heat up Haldor's neck. In 3 days, they would speak vows before the village. Until this moment, it had felt like a distant formality. Now, with this formidable woman examining his life like a potential purchase, the reality crashed over him like a cold wave. "And what should your husband know about you?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. Brynja's laugh was short and sharp as a blade. "That I've survived 28 winters in a world that prefers its women quiet and compliant. That I can kill a man as easily as cook his supper. That I've come here seeking something I've never had before, which is a partner. Not a master, not a protector, not someone who'll try to gentle me like a wild horse." She gestured toward his modest stone house with its well-tended garden. "You've built a life of quiet dignity here. I respect that. But I won't disappear into it like smoke." The directness of her declaration should have been intimidating. Instead, Haldor found it oddly refreshing. For years, conversations in the village had been careful, circling around his past like wolves around a fire. Everyone knew who he'd been, but no one spoke of it directly. Brynja, by contrast, seemed to prefer her truths served raw. "I wouldn't expect you to," he said finally. "Good, because I have conditions." Of course she did. Haldor gestured toward his house. "Would you like to discuss them inside? Or should we negotiate here in the road like merchants?" Another of those sharp laughs. "Inside, then. But I warn you, I don't drink ale like a maiden sipping from a cup. If you have mead, I'll take it strong." As they entered his home, Haldor tried to see the space through her eyes. The main room was simply furnished but comfortable along. Table he'd crafted himself, chairs with warm but sturdy cushions, a hearth that threw warm light across wooden floors polished smooth by years of use. Shelves lined one wall, holding books he'd taught himself to read during the long winter nights. The space spoke of solitude but not loneliness, of a man who'd made peace with his own company. Brynja moved through the room with the alertness of a warrior, noting the exits, the weapon rack empty now but clearly used, the thick walls that would offer protection in hostile times. When her gaze fell on the books, her eyebrows rose slightly. "You read?" "I learned. Yes." The long nights required distraction. She pulled one volume from the shelf, a collection of sodateles he'd acquired from a traveling merchant. "Can you write as well?" "Adequately." Another useful skill in a husband. She replaced the book carefully. "My first husband couldn't manage his own name in runes. My second could barely count past 20 without removing his boots." The comparison hung in the air between them, and Haldor found himself wondering if he was being measured against ghosts. How did a man compete with the dead, especially the heroic dead who died in battle rather than fade slowly into age? "Your conditions," he prompted, settling into the chair across from where she'd chosen to sit. The table between them felt less like furniture than a negotiating ground. "First, I keep my weapons and my shield. They're not decorations or dowry pieces. They're tools of survival." "Agreed." "Second, I won't be confined to hearth and home. Like a tame cat. If there's trouble in the village, if there's need for someone who understands war, I'll answer that call." Haldor considered this. In most marriages, such independence would be unthinkable. But then, this wasn't most marriages. The villagers might not. The villagers will learn to accept it, or they won't. But you need to accept it, or this arrangement ends before it begins. Her tone brooked no negotiation. Haldor found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications. What else? Third, and here her voice softened slightly, though her gaze remained steady, "I won't pretend to love you. Not at first, perhaps not ever. I've buried love twice, and I'm not sure I have the strength to grow it again. But I'll be loyal, I'll be honest, and I'll stand beside you when the storms come. If that's not enough, She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. This was the bargain she offered: partnership without the pretty lies of romance, strength without submission, honesty without the comfort of illusion. Haldor studied her face, noting the way her fingers drummed once against the table, the only sign of nervousness she'd shown. This woman had crossed dangerous waters to reach him, leaving behind everything familiar for an arrangement with a stranger. Whatever armor she wore, it couldn't protect her from all forms of vulnerability. "And what do you ask of me in return?" he said quietly. "The same honesty, the same loyalty, and patience while we learn whether two broken things can be mended together or whether they'll simply cut each other to pieces." Outside, he could hear the voices of villagers returning to their daily tasks, the excitement of the morning's arrival, settling into the rhythm of ordinary life. But nothing about this felt ordinary. In accepting Brynja's conditions, he was agreeing to a kind of marriage that existed nowhere in the old stories. One built on mutual respect rather than dominance, partnership rather than protection. 3 days until the ceremony, he said. 3 days, she agreed. Time enough to see if we can stand each other's company without drawing steel. Despite everything, the upheaval of his expectations, the challenge to everything he'd thought he wanted from this arrangement, Haldor found himself almost smiling. "I think," he said carefully, "this will be interesting." Brynja's answering smile was fierce and somehow beautiful. "Interesting," she agreed, "is far better than boring." The marriage contract scroll lay unrolled on Haldor's table, its formal language suddenly seeming inadequate to describe the reality of their arrangement. Elder Grimm had drafted it carefully, with clauses about property, bloodline, and duty, all the proper concerns of a traditional Norse marriage. But those words felt thin as parchment compared to the flesh and blood woman who now occupied the other half of his home. Brynja had claimed the smaller sleeping chamber without ceremony, hanging her shield on the wall as other women might display. Tapestries, their few possessions, spoke of a life lived always ready to move: practical clothing, well-maintained weapons, a small wooden chest that she kept locked. No trinkets, no sentimental keepsakes, nothing that couldn't be carried in a single pack. "You travel light," Haldor observed on their second morning together, finding her examining his garden with the same critical attention she'd given his forge. "Heavy things weigh you down when you need to run." She knelt beside a row of herbs, testing the soil between her fingers. "You've got good earth here. These plants are well tended. Medicinal herbs mostly. Feverfew, willow bark, comfrey for wounds." He joined her among the growing things, oddly proud of this small accomplishment. "I learned their uses during the long winters. Useful knowledge." Brynja pulled a sprig of mint, crushing it between her fingers to release its scent. "My second husband had no patience for healing arts. Said if the gods wanted a man to live, he wouldn't need plants and potions. What did you think? That the gods gave us minds to learn with and hands to heal with. Seemed foolish not to use them." She stood, brushing dirt from her palms. "He died of a fever that willow bark tea might have broken." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the practical acceptance of a truth learned too late. Haldor found himself studying her profile as she surveyed his modest homestead. In daylight, without the dramatic backdrop of the Longship's arrival, she seemed more human, still formidable, but touched with the same mortality that shadowed all their lives. "The village is talking," he said carefully. "I imagine they are. What did they say? That you're not what they expected. That you might be too much for their quiet blacksmith." Brynja's laugh held genuine humor this time. "Are you?" The question caught him off guard. Was he intimidated by her? Certainly. Uncertain about their future? Absolutely. But too much? As he watched her gentle handling of his herb plants, her obvious appreciation for the small skills he'd developed in his years of solitude, he found himself thinking the opposite might be true. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might not be enough for you." She turned to face him fully, those pale eyes searching his face with characteristic directness. "You think I need a hero from the old stories? Some young warrior with golden hair and pretty words, don't you? If I wanted a hero, I would have stayed in my father's hall where there are plenty to choose from." She gestured toward the village beyond his garden wall. "I came here seeking something different. A man who's learned to value peace without losing the strength to fight for it when necessary." Her words stirred something in his chest, a warmth he'd almost forgotten how to feel. When had anyone last seen him as something other than a reformed killer trying to atone for his past? Brynja spoke of his choices as strengths rather than failures, his quiet life as wisdom rather than cowardice. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Astrid the Weaver, approaching with the measured step of someone on an important mission. The older woman's arms were full of fabric-rich blue wool and fine linen in cream and gold. "For the ceremony," Astrid announced, setting her burden on the garden bench. "The village women thought, that is, we hoped you might need." She faltered under Brynja's steady gaze, clearly uncertain how to address a bride who wore mail instead of embroidery. "Wedding clothes," Brynja said, understanding immediately. "That's thoughtful. We weren't sure of your size," Astrid admitted, her cheeks coloring. "You're taller than most. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course." "There isn't," Brynja agreed mildly. "I found my height useful in many situations." Haldor bit back a smile at the diplomatic understatement. He could imagine how useful being 6 feet tall would be in battle, especially when one's opponents expected to face someone more conventionally sized. "Would you like to see what we've prepared?" Astrid asked, eager now. "The other women are gathered at my house. We could make adjustments if needed." Brynja glanced at Haldor, and he caught something almost vulnerable in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty that she quickly mastered. "Go," he encouraged. "I'll be at the forge if you need me." Watching the two women walk toward the village center, he found himself marveling at the strange turns his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary man facing an uncertain future with a stranger. Now he was genuinely curious about how that stranger would navigate the well-meaning but overwhelming attention of Ravenshallow's women at his forge. He tried to focus on work, but his concentration kept drifting. The sound of feminine laughter carried on the wind from Astrid's house, and he wondered if Brynja was finding any common ground with his neighbors. She was so utterly unlike the women of his village direct, where they were subtle, practical, where they were decorative, battle-tested, where they were protected. "She certainly stirred up the henhouse," Bjorn commented, appearing with a fishing net in need of repair. "My wife came home yesterday full of questions about Shieldmaidens and whether it's true. They can split a man from crown to groin with a single sword stroke." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd rather not find out," Bjorn grinned. "But between you and me, old friend, I'm impressed. Takes courage to cross unknown waters for an arranged marriage. Takes even more courage to do it on your own terms." Haldor worked the bellows, considering this. He'd been thinking of Brynja's strength in terms of physical prowess, her height, her weapons, her obvious skill in battle. But Bjorn was right about a different kind of courage. She'd left everything familiar to make a new life with a stranger, and she'd done it without compromising who she was. "Do you think it will work?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Bjorn studied his weathered face with the wisdom of a man who'd seen many storms. "That depends." "Do you want it to work?" The honest answer was complicated. He'd agreed to this marriage out of duty, expecting a conventional arrangement that would satisfy the village elders while disturbing his quiet life as little as possible. Instead, he'd gotten Brynja, a woman who challenged every assumption he'd made about what marriage might mean at his age. But as he considered Bjorn's question, he realized that yes, he did want it to work. Not the careful, polite partnership he'd originally envisioned, but whatever this might become, this strange alliance between two people who, understood that life's battles left marks on the soul as well as the body. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Brynja emerged from the village looking slightly dazed but not displeased. Behind her trailed a small procession of women, their faces bright with the satisfaction of a successful mission. "Well," Astrid called to Haldor, "what do you think?" Brynja had been transformed, though not tamed. The blue wool dress fit her tall frame perfectly, its simple lines emphasizing her natural dignity rather than trying to disguise her strength. Her copper hair had been braided with silver ribbons, and someone had convinced her to accept a delicate necklace of amber beads. She looked magnificent, every inch a woman worthy of respect and admiration, but it was the expression in her eyes that caught his attention. For the first time since her arrival, she looked genuinely pleased, even touched by the village women's efforts on her behalf. "Beautiful," he said simply, and meant it. Color rose in her cheeks, the first blush he'd seen from her. "They've been very kind," she said, including the gathered women in her gratitude. "I'm not accustomed to such attention." "You'd better get used to it," laughed Olaf's wife Greta. "You're one of us now. That means you'll never lack for advice, opinions, or help whether you want it or not." The casual acceptance in those words seemed to surprise Brynja more than any formal ceremony could have. She'd been prepared for suspicion, perhaps even rejection. Instead, she'd found welcome in the most fundamental way through the patient work of women who'd seen her uncertainty and responded with practical kindness. As the group dispersed, chattering about final preparations for tomorrow's ceremony, Haldor found himself alone with his bride-to-be once more. She stood awkwardly in her wedding finery, as if unsure whether to change back into her usual practical clothing or remain dressed for inspection. "Keep it on," he suggested. "You should see how you look." He led her to the polished metal mirror. That served his modest needs, watching her face as she took in her transformed appearance. The woman in the reflection was undeniably beautiful, but more than that, she looked like someone who belonged somewhere, who had roots and connections beyond the practical necessities of survival. "I'd forgotten," she said softly, "what it felt like to be double quotes." She paused, searching for words. "Cared for?" he suggested. "Welcomed," she corrected. "Not needed for what I could do or provide, but simply welcomed." Something shifted in that moment, some invisible barrier beginning to crack. Tomorrow they would speak vows and become husband and wife-in-law. But today, watching Brynja discover that she could be accepted for who she was rather than what she could offer, Haldor began to hope they might become something more, partners in the truest sense. Two people choosing to build something together, rather than simply enduring an arrangement made by others. The marriage contract on his table might spell out duties and obligations in formal language, but the real terms of their union were being written in smaller moments like this, in shared silences, mutual respect, and a growing recognition that they might actually suit each other in ways neither had dared to expect. The wooden hair comb was simple, unadorned, nothing like the elaborate silver pieces the village women had offered to lend her for the ceremony. Brynja ran her fingers along its smooth surface, finding comfort in its plainness as she sat by the dying embers of Haldor's hearth. Their wedding day had passed in a blur of ceremony and celebration, but now, in the quiet of their first night, as husband and wife, reality settled around them like evening mist. "My first husband gave this to me," she said quietly, aware of Haldor moving carefully around the room as he banked the fire for the night. "Carved it himself from driftwood, he found after a storm." Haldor paused in his task but didn't turn around. "You don't have to tell me about them if it pains you." "It doesn't pain me anymore, not the way it used to." She set the comb in her lap, studying its worn edges. "Eric was barely 18 when we wed. I was 16 and thought I knew everything about love and war and life. We had 3 summers together. Before the battle at Stamford Bridge, The wood shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Haldor finished with his tending and settled into the chair across from her, his face kind but carefully neutral. She appreciated that he didn't offer empty condolences or uncomfortable platitudes. He used to comb my hair every night, she continued. Said it was like touching sunlight, that my hair was the only beautiful thing he'd ever owned. A small smile touched her lips. I told him he didn't own it, that it belonged to me, and he laughed and said that was what made it beautiful. He sounds like a good man. He was. Young and foolish sometimes, but good. He died believing he was protecting our future children, our old age together, all the life we thought we'd have. She turned the comb over in her hands. Magnus, my second husband, he never understood why I kept this. Sod I was holding on to. Ghosts. Were you? Brynja considered the question seriously. Perhaps, but not the way he meant. I wasn't trying to bring Eric back from the dead, or pretend Magnus was someone else. I was trying to remember what it felt like to be cherished for something other than my sword arm. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Haldor's eyes were thoughtful as he studied her face in the firelight, and she wondered what he saw there, whether her scars and weathered features spoke of strength or merely of survival. Magnus was different? He asked gently. Older, more practical. He saw marriage as an alliance between warriors rather than— She gestured vaguely, struggling for words. He respected my skills, valued my counsel in battle, treated me as an dawdle, equal in all the ways that mattered for war. But he never combed my hair. The contrast seemed foolish when spoken aloud, but Haldor nodded as if he understood perfectly. The small tenderness matter as much as the grand gestures. Yes, she met his eyes directly. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand. I'm not looking to replace what I've lost. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending that the tender parts of me died with my first husband. Haldor was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across his weathered features. When he spoke, his voice was careful but warm. In the year before my exile, I stopped noticing small beauties. Sunrises, the way ice forms on the fjord, the sound of children laughing, all of it became invisible to me. I was so focused on the next raid, the next battle, the next chance for glory that I forgot there was any other way to live. What changed? I killed a boy. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. Couldn't have been more than 15. He came at me with a farming tool, trying to protect his village, and I cut him down without thinking. Afterward, when the battle madness faded, I knelt beside him and really saw what I'd done. Not to an enemy, but to someone's son. Someone's hope for the future. Brynja had heard similar stories from other warriors, but she recognized the weight this particular memory carried for him. That's when you came here. That's when I realized I had to choose what kind of man I wanted to be with whatever years the gods granted me. I could keep adding bodies to my count, or I could find another way to matter in this world. He gestured around the comfortable room they now shared. 10 years of quiet has taught me to see small things again. The way morning light moves across the wall. The satisfaction of a blade properly tempered. The taste of bread still warm from the oven. And now you have a wife who carries weapons and speaks too bluntly and probably doesn't know how to bake. Bread. His smile was genuine, transforming his face entirely. Now I have a wife who understands that life is fragile and precious, who's learned to value both strength and gentleness, who might teach me new ways to see the world. The warmth in his voice sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. She prepared herself for duty, for respect, perhaps even for companionship given time. But this careful tenderness, this willingness to see her complexity without trying to simplify her was something she hadn't dared hope for. I should warn you, she said, trying to lighten the moment. I really don't know how to bake bread. My talents run more toward preserving meat and brewing strong ale. Useful skills for a village that depends on hunting and fishing. Haldor's eyes crinkled with amusement. Though Astrid might insist on teaching you at least basic bread making, she takes the feeding of neighbors very seriously. I could learn, if you wanted me to. The offer surprised them both. Brynja had spent years refusing to be molded into anyone else's idea of proper womanhood. Yet here she was volunteering to acquire domestic skills for this quiet man who asked nothing of her but honesty. I'd like that, Haldor said simply. Not because I expected, but because it would be something we could share. You could teach me your ale brewing in return. The idea of shared knowledge, of teaching and learning together, felt like laying the foundation for something substantial. Not the quick passion of youth or the practical alliance of necessity, but the slow building of understanding that might, with time and patience, grow into something deeper. Their conversation was interrupted by voices outside young Bjorn calling for help with unusual urgency. Both of them were on their feet immediately, old warrior instincts responding to the tone of alarm. Haldor reached for the seeks at his belt, while Brynja moved toward where her sword hung beside the door. Haldor. Brynja, come quickly. There's been an accident at the harbor. They exchanged a glance that held volumes of communication. Their wedding night would have to wait. Their village needed them. As they stepped into the cool night air, Brynja realized that this was their first test as partners, not lovers or even friends necessarily, but two people choosing to face trouble together. The harbor was chaos when they arrived. Young Leif, barely 14, had fallen from the dock while securing fishing nets and struck his head on the rocks below. Villagers clustered around his unconscious form, voices overlapping in panic and conflicting advice. Back away. Give him air, Brynja commanded, her voice cutting through the confusion with authority that brooked no argument. People stepped aside instinctively, creating space around the injured boy. Haldor knelt beside Leif, his hands gentle as he examined the head wound. The bleeding's not as bad as it looks, he said, but he hasn't woken up. That's the real concern. We should move him to shelter, someone suggested. No, Brynja's sharp refusal stopped the speaker mid-motion. Head injuries can be made worse by moving too quickly. We need to know if his neck or spine are damaged before we risk lifting him. Working together without need for discussion, they conducted a careful examination. Haldor's knowledge of healing herbs and basic medical care combined with Brynja's battlefield experience treating wounded warriors. Their hands moved over the boy's still form with practiced efficiency, checking for breaks or dangerous swelling. His color's good. Breathing steady, Haldor murmured. No obvious breaks in arms or legs. Neck seems stable. Brynja gently probed the base of Leif's skull. The confusion suggests a strong blow, but nothing that feels like a fracture. As if summoned. By their careful assessment, Leif's eyelids fluttered. A collective sigh of relief rose from the gathered villagers as the boy groaned and tried to sit up. Easy, lad, Haldor said, supporting him carefully. You took quite a tumble. How do you feel? Like a troll used my head for drumming practice. Leif mumbled, but his speech was clear and his eyes focused properly when he looked around. What happened? As the immediate crisis passed and they helped the boy to his feet, carefully, with multiple people supporting him, Brynja became aware of the villagers' faces around them. She saw respect there and something more. Acceptance. They'd seen her take charge in an emergency, seen her work seamlessly with Haldor to help one of their own, and they approved. More importantly, she caught Haldor watching her with an expression of quiet pride. Not possessive satisfaction, but genuine admiration for how she'd handled herself. The look warmed her more than any pretty compliment could have. Walking back to their home afterward, their hands accidentally brushed and neither pulled away. It was a small thing barely worthy of notice, but it felt like progress, like two careful people allowing themselves to begin hoping that this strange arrangement might become something good. "Thank you," Haldor said as they reached their door. "For what?" "For showing me what we could be together." Brynja looked down at the simple wooden comb still clutched in her free hand, thinking of Eric's gentle hands and Magnus's practical respect and this new possibility that seemed to offer elements of both. "We work well together," she agreed softly. "Yes," Haldor said, holding the door open for her. "We do. It wasn't love yet. Might never be love in the consuming way of the old stories. But it was partnership, respect, and the beginning of trust. For two people who'd both learned that life could change in an instant. That was enough to build on. The sword had been hidden for so long that dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight. When Haldor lifted the wooden chest lid, beneath layers of oiled cloth lay his father's blade, the weapon that had earned him his fearsome reputation, that had drunk deeply of enemy blood across a dozen battlefields. Now it seemed smaller somehow, less significant than the mythic proportions it had assumed in his memory. "You've been thinking about that chest for days," Brynja observed from the doorway. She'd been watching him, he realized, noting the way. His gaze drifted toward the corner where his past lay buried in oak and iron. "Word came from the Coast Watchers this morning," Haldor said, lifting the sword from its resting place. The blade was still perfect, its edge keen despite years of neglect. His father had taught him to care for weapons properly, a lesson that served him even in exile. Ships on the horizon. Unfamiliar sails. Brynja stepped into the room, her expression sharpening with professional interest. "How many?" "3 longships, flying red and black banners. They're not traders too heavily. Armed, moving too deliberately." He tested the sword's balance, muscle memory flooding back despite his peaceful years. "The village council wants to know if they're raiders or simply passing through. And they've asked you to help determine which." She understood immediately. In times of potential danger, peaceful communities remembered their warriors, even reformed ones. "What do you think?" "I think," Haldor said carefully, "that I hope never to hold this blade again." The weight of the sword in his hands brought back memories he'd worked hard to bury. The taste of blood in his mouth after battle. The way metal sang when it met metal. The terrible clarity that came with fighting for one's life. He traded all of that for the honest work of his forge, for quiet mornings and peaceful sleep. The peace was a luxury that had to be defended. "Tell me about the red and black banners," Brynja said, settling beside him on the bed they now shared. Her presence was steady, grounding him in the present moment rather than the ghosts of past battles. Grimjaw's clan. The name left a bitter taste in his mouth. Olaf Grimjaw styled himself a great war chief, but he was really just a clever pirate. Last I heard, he was raiding along the southern coasts. "You have history with him." It wasn't a question. Brynja had learned to read the subtle changes in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when certain memories surfaced. The intimacy of that understanding still surprised him. How quickly she'd learned to see past his careful composure to the man beneath. "We raided together, years ago, before I understood what kind of man he really was." Haldor set the sword across his knees, studying its familiar weight. Grimjaw had no honor. He killed prisoners, burned sacred groves, took thralls from among children too young to defend themselves. When I refused to continue sailing with him, he swore he'd repay the insult someday. How long ago was this? 15 years, perhaps more. I'd hoped he was dead by now. The life he lived didn't encourage longevity. Brynja was quiet for a moment, thinking. When she spoke, her voice carried the practical edge he'd come to associate with her strategic mind. "If it is Grimjaw, and if he's coming here specifically, then this isn't random piracy. This is personal." The same conclusion had been forming in Haldor's own thoughts, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real, more immediate. He brought this danger to Raven's Hollow by the simple act of existing here. The peaceful village that it offered. Him's sanctuary might pay the price for his past mistakes. I should leave, he said quietly. Draw him away from here. And abandon your home? Your people? Brynja's voice sharpened. Run like a coward and let him terrorize innocents while he hunts. For you? Better than letting him burn the village to get to me. Is it? She turned to face him fully, those pale eyes fierce with conviction. What does running solve? He'll still be out there, still be a threat. And you'll spend whatever years you have left looking over your shoulder, wondering when he'll catch up. Her logic was sound, but it ignored the weight of responsibility that sat on his shoulders like a stone. These people took me in when I had nothing to offer but a name and a promise to live peacefully. I can't repay that kindness by bringing war to their doorstep. You can repay it by standing with them when war comes regardless. Brynja's hand covered his on the sword's hilt. I've seen what happens to communities that lose their protectors. They don't thank you for leaving, they curse your name while they burn. The touch of her fingers was warm, steadying. In the weeks since their marriage, they'd developed a language of small gestures, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing during shared tasks, the comfort of presence without the need for words. She was offering him her strength now, sharing the burden of a decision that would affect not just them, but everyone they'd come to care about. You think we should fight, he said. I think we should prepare to fight and hope we won't have to. She squeezed his hand gently. But yes, if it comes to that, I think we stand our ground. A knock at their door interrupted the moment. Elder. Grim's voice called from outside, tight with barely controlled urgency. Haldor, Brynja, the council needs you both. Now. They found the village gathered in the great hall, faces tense with the particular fear that came from threats beyond their control. The coast watchers had returned with more detailed reports, and none of the news was encouraging. 3 ships, reported Hakon the fisherman, his weathered face grim. At least 40 warriors, maybe more. They're making camp on Seal Island, close. Enough to strike, but far enough to avoid our own scouts. Any word on their intentions? Asked Elder Grim. They sent a messenger under flag of truce, Hakon continued. Young man, barely old enough to hold a sword. He asked specifically for. Haldor Eriksson said, his chief has business with the wolf of the northern seas. A murmur ran through the assembled villagers. Some looked at Haldor with accusation, others with fear, but most simply waited to see what their protector would do. The weight of their expectations settled on his shoulders like mail. What was your response? Brynja asked, her voice carrying easily through the hall. We told him Haldor would consider meeting under terms of parley. The boy said his chief would wait until tomorrow at sunset for an answer. A generous deadline, Haldor said dryly. Grimjaw always did enjoy his theatrical gestures. You know this man? Elder Grim's question carried undertones of reproach, the disappointment of someone who'd hoped the past was truly buried. I know him, and I know that negotiation isn't his strength. Haldor stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Olaf Grimjaw keeps no bargains except those made in blood. If he's here, it's because he wants something specific, and he won't leave without it. What does he want? Someone called from the back of the hall. Haldor met Brynja's gaze, seeing his own grim understanding reflected there. My death, and probably the village's submission after he's made an example of me. The hall erupted in worried voices, people calling out questions and fears all at once. But Elder Grim raised his staff for silence, his old voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. Then we have a choice to make, he said simply. Do we hand over one of our own to buy peace that may not last? Or do we stand together and face whatever comes? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Haldor looked around. The room at faces he'd come to know Bjorn, who'd been his first friend here. Astrid, who'd welcomed Brynja with such warmth. Young Leif, whose life they'd saved just weeks before. These people had given him a home when he'd needed one most. Now his presence threatened everything they built. "There's another option," Brynja said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through leather. "We could make Grimjaw's choice for him." All eyes turned to her, and Haldor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He recognized the look in her eyes, the cold calculation of a warrior planning battle. "What do you mean?" Elder Grim asked carefully. "I mean," Brynja said, "that sometimes the best defense is to strike first." The golden band around Brynja's finger caught the firelight as she turned her first husband's wedding ring over and over in her palm. She sat alone in their bedchamber while Haldor attended another council meeting, wrestling with ghosts that refused to stay buried. Outside, the village buzzed with preparations for a battle that might never come or might arrive with the morning tide. Eric's ring was simple, unadorned, bearing only the scratches and dents of a young man's life cut short. She'd worn it on a chain around her neck for years after his death, then later on her finger when she married Magnus, not as a betrayal of her second husband, but as a reminder that love could exist alongside loss, that carrying the past didn't mean being trapped by it, though Magnus had never asked her to remove it. He'd understood, perhaps better than she had at the time, that some things couldn't be replaced, only added to. Their relationship had been built on that understanding. Two people who'd both lost much, finding comfort in shared strength rather than shared vulnerability. But now, with the prospect of battle looming and death once again stalking the edges of her world, the ring felt like a weight she could no longer carry. Not because she loved Eric less, but because she'd begun to love someone else in an entirely different way. "Still awake?" Haldor's voice was soft as he entered their chamber, moving carefully in the darkness so as not to disturb her if she'd been sleeping. "Can't seem to settle." She held up the ring so he could see it in the dim light. "I've been thinking about choices, about what we carry with us and what we have to set down." He settled beside her on the bed, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close as to crowd her in her contemplation. The careful distance spoke of respect, of understanding that some thoughts needed space to breathe. "The council meeting?" she asked. "Long, contentious. Half the village wants to flee inland until the threat passes. The other half wants to fight but has no idea how." His voice carried the weariness of someone who'd spent hours arguing practical matters with people who'd never held a sword in anger. "They've agreed to follow our lead, whatever we decide. No pressure there. None at all." His dry humor made her smile despite the circumstances. "What were you thinking about with the ring?" Brynja closed her fingers around the small golden circle, feeling its familiar weight one last time. About the difference between honoring the dead and being bound by them. About whether it's possible to love someone new without betraying someone lost. The confession hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch they'd shared. In the weeks since their marriage, they'd grown comfortable with each other, partners in the practical matters of daily life. Companions who shared meals and conversations and the small satisfactions of shared work. But this was different. This was the acknowledgement of something deeper, more dangerous. "What do you think?" Haldor asked quietly. "I think," she said slowly, "that Eric would want me to be happy. And I think Magnus would want me to be strong. But I also think I'm tired of making all my choices based on what dead men might have wanted instead of what the living woman needs." She opened her hand again, studying the ring in the pale moonlight filtering through their window. "I've been afraid, I think. Not of death. I've never feared that. But of caring too much again, of having something precious to lose. And now? Now I realize that I've already lost that battle." She turned to look at him, meeting his eyes directly. "I care about you, Haldor Eriksson. Not as a replacement for what I've lost, not as a safe harbor from the storms of life, but as yourself. as the man who tends his garden with the same patience he once used to forge steel, who reads by firelight and knows the healing properties of herbs, who chose peace without losing the strength to fight for what matters. The words settled between them like snow, soft but transformative. Haldor's face was carefully controlled, but she could see the emotion moving beneath the surface, hope and fear, and something that might have been wonder. "I care about you too," he said simply. "More than I expected to. More than I thought I was still capable of. But tomorrow we might have to fight for our lives. And I know what battle does to people, to relationships, to the careful things we build in peacetime." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with gentle firmness. "I don't want whatever this is between us to be born from desperation or the fear of dying before we've had a chance to live." His honesty was like a blade sharp, necessary, and painful in its precision. She understood what he was saying, recognized the wisdom in it. Emotions heightened by danger weren't always reliable guides to lasting truth. But she also knew something he might not, that for warriors, there was often no clear line between peacetime and wartime, between the luxury of contemplation and the necessity of action. "Do you know what Magnus taught me?" she said, shifting so she could face him fully. "That love isn't something that happens to you, like weather or illness. It's something you choose every day, regardless of circumstances. He chose to love me knowing he might lose me to battle. I chose to love him knowing the same thing. This is different. Is it? Or are you just afraid because it matters more than you expected it to?" The question hit its mark. She could see the truth of it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing changed. For all his hard-won wisdom, Haldor was still a man who'd spent 10 years in careful solitude, protecting himself from the very vulnerability that made connection possible. "I lost everyone once," he said quietly. "My battle brothers, my clan, my sense of who I was supposed to be. I came here to escape that pain, to build something smaller and safer. But you," he paused, struggling with words, "you make me want to risk everything again." "Good." She brought his hand to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. "Because safe love isn't really love at all. It's just comfortable cowardice dressed up in pretty words." Before he could respond, she stood and moved to the window, opening it to let in the cool night air. Without ceremony, she drew back her arm and threw Eric's ring out into the darkness, where it disappeared with a tiny splash in the fjord below. "What did you just do?" Haldor asked, startled. "Set us both free." She returned to the bed, settling close enough to him that their shoulders touched. "Eric is dead. Magnus is dead. But we're alive, and tomorrow we might have to fight to stay that way. I don't want to waste whatever time we have being careful with each other. Brynja, I love you." The words came out strong and clear, without hesitation or qualification. "Not because you're safe, not because you remind me of someone else, not because I need protecting or saving. I love you because you're a good man who's learned hard lessons and chosen to use them wisely. Because you make me laugh and you make me think, and you make me want to be better than I was yesterday." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the shore. Haldor stared at her as if she'd just performed some impossible feat of magic, as if love declared so simply and directly was something beyond his experience. "I love you too," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, I love you too." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of someone who'd been given an unexpected gift and wasn't sure he deserved to keep it. She kissed him back with the fierce certainty of a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for wanting something good in her life. They made love that night with the slow intensity of people who knew how precious and fragile such moments were. No words of forever, no promises about surviving the trials ahead, just two people choosing each other completely in the space between. Heartbeats, creating something beautiful in the shadow of uncertainty. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of passion and honest emotion. Brynja felt a peace she hadn't experienced since childhood. Not the peace of safety, but the peace of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. No regrets, Haldor murmured against her hair. None. She traced lazy patterns on his chest, memorizing the feel of him. Whatever happens with Grimjaw, whatever choices we have to make, at least we'll face them as partners. Real partners, not just two people sharing a bed and a name. Real partners, he agreed, his arms tightening around her. In love and war and whatever comes after. Outside their window, the sea sang its eternal song of change and continuity, of tides that ebbed and flowed, but never truly ceased. The village slept fitfully, preparing for a battle that would test everything they built together. But in their small room, in their small bed, love had been born from honesty and choice rather than desperation and fear. It was. Brynja thought drowsily, exactly the kind of love worth fighting for. The enemy clan banner snapped in the morning. Wind like a serpent's tongue, its red and black design stark against the gray sky. But it wasn't the colors that made Haldor's blood run cold. It was the smaller pennant flying beneath it, bearing symbols he'd hoped never to see again. 3 interlocked rings on a field of blue. The mark of the Iron Brotherhood. Do you see it? Brynja's voice was tight as she stood beside him on the watchtower, her sharp eyes reading the distant banners with the skill of someone who'd learned that such details could mean the difference between life and death. I see it. His mouth felt dry as old leather. The Iron Brotherhood. The mercenary company that had been Grimjaw's tool for his most vicious work, and the same group that had been hired to eliminate Brynja's first husband at Stamford Bridge. That's impossible, Brynja whispered, her face pale as winter stone. The Iron Brotherhood was destroyed years ago. I saw their leader's head mounted on a pike myself after Eric died. You saw Ragnar One-Eye's head, Haldor corrected grimly. But the Brotherhood was larger than just one man. And if Grimjaw has reformed them, he didn't finish the sentence. They both understood the implications. The pieces of a puzzle that had seemed separate were suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Brynja's arranged marriage to a warrior in an obscure coastal village. The timing of Grimjaw's arrival. The careful way the marriage contract had been negotiated through intermediaries who'd known exactly which strings to pull. This wasn't random, Brynja said, voicing what they were both thinking. Our marriage, it was planned, orchestrated. But by whom? And why? Their answer came sooner than expected. A single rider approached under a flag of truce, but instead of the young messenger from before, this was a figure they both recognized. Thorvald Descard, Grimjaw's longtime second-in-command, bore new marks of rank and old scars from battles both of them remembered all too well. He wants to parley, Eldergrim reported when the messenger's demands were relayed. Both of you. On the beach below the village, before the sun reaches its peak. It's a trap, Bjorn said flatly. Has to be. Of course it's a trap, Brynja agreed. But it's also an opportunity to learn what we're really facing. Haldor studied her profile, noting the way her jaw had set with familiar determination. You want to go. I want answers. Don't you? He did, though every instinct screamed against walking into Grimjaw's reach. But Brynja was right. They needed to understand what they were truly facing before they could hope to defend against it. The beach felt exposed despite the weapon they both carried. Grimjaw waited with theatrical patience, flanked by 4 warriors whose scars and bearing marked them as survivors of countless battles. But it was the man standing slightly apart from the group who made Brynja's breath catch in her throat. Impossible, she breathed. Magnus Ironside stood 20 paces away, very much alive, despite the funeral pyre she'd lit for him 3 years past. Older now, bearing new scars across his weathered face, but undeniably the man she buried with. her own hands. "Hello, wife," Magnus said, his voice carrying the same dry humor she remembered. "You look well. Marriage to the wolf suits you. You're dead." The words came out flat, disbelieving. "I burned your body myself. I watched the flames take you." "You burned a body," Magnus corrected gently. "A poor sod who'd taken fever and died in my place while I was away on Grimjo's business. By the time I returned, you'd already sailed for your new husband's arms." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Haldor moved protectively closer, but Brynja waved him back. This was her ghost to face, her past to unravel. "Why?" she asked. "Why let me believe? Because the plan required it," Grimjo interrupted, stepping forward with the swagger of a man who held all the pieces of the game. "Your grief, your isolation, your desperate need for a new start, it all made you the perfect tool for reaching our real target." "Me," Haldor said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You." Grimjaw's smile was sharp as a blade. The wolf of the northern seas, living peacefully in his little village, thinking his past was buried. "Do you have any idea how many people you wronged in your raiding days, Haldor? How many families you destroyed? How many sons and daughters who swore vengeance on your name?" "The blood debt," Magnus added, his voice almost apologetic. "There are those who've waited years for the chance to balance the scales. And you thought, that I'd run? That I'd abandon these people to save my own skin?" "We thought," Grimjaw said with satisfaction, "that you'd fight. We counted on it, in fact. Because the only thing better than killing you quietly would be destroying everything you've learned to love first, then taking your head as you watch your new life burn." The casual cruelty of it stole Brynja's breath. She'd been manipulated like a game piece moved across a board by players she'd never suspected existed. Her marriage, her growing love for Haldor, even her tentative acceptance by the village all of it had been part of someone else's elaborate revenge. "The Iron Brotherhood," she said, pieces clicking into place. "You've been rebuilding it." "Better than before," Thorvald confirmed. "More selective in our contracts, more thorough in our planning. This has been 3 years in the making, from Magnus's staged death to the marriage negotiations to choosing exactly the right moment to strike." "But there's still a chance to avoid bloodshed," Magnus said, his tone reasonable. "Brynja, you could come with us. Resume your place at my side. You never truly mourned me. We both know that. This marriage to the wolf was just survival, not love, was it?" Haldor asked quietly, and there was something dangerous in his voice that made even Grimjo's warriors shift nervously. Brynja looked between the two men who represented such different parts of her life. Magnus, the practical warrior who'd given her respect and companionship but never true intimacy. Haldor, who'd shown her that love could be both gentle and fierce, who'd created space for all the parts of herself she'd learned to hide. "No," she said clearly, "it wasn't survival, it was choice." Magnus's face hardened. "You'd choose him over me? Over the life we built together? You're dead, Magnus. You chose to be dead 3 years ago when you let me light that pyre. Whatever we had, you ended it then." She moved to stand beside Haldor, their shoulders touching in a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. "This is my life now. These are my people. And if you want to hurt them, you'll have to go through me." "So be it," Grimjaw said with obvious satisfaction. "I'd hoped to avoid the mess of killing you, girl, but if you insist on standing with the wolf, then you'll share his fate." "One last question," Haldor said, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Who's paying you for this? Who wants my death badly enough to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme?" Grimjaw's smile was all teeth and malice. "Oh, that's the beautiful part, Wolf. You'll never see it coming, because you trust him completely. But don't worry, when the time comes, he'll explain everything before he takes your head." The words hit like hammer blows, but before either, of them could demand clarification. Grimjaw was already backing away with his men, Magnus among them like a ghost returned to haunt the living. "Sunset tomorrow," Grimjaw called back to them. "Bring whatever warriors you can muster. It won't matter in the end, but it will make the victory sweeter." As the enemy group disappeared back toward their ships, Haldor and Brynja stood alone on the windswept beach, both struggling to process the magnitude of what they'd learned. "Someone in the village," Brynja said finally. "Someone we trust is working with them. It appears so." Haldor's voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the pain beneath the surface. He'd found sanctuary in Raven's Hollow, acceptance, from people who'd known his history and chosen to offer him a home anyway. To learn that one of them had been plotting against him all along was a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. "We'll figure out who," she said firmly, "and we'll stop them. Will we?" He turned to look at her, his eyes haunted. "You just found out your dead husband is alive and working with my enemies. You could leave with him, Brynja. Return to a life you know, with a man who—" "Stop." She caught his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Don't you dare question what I said back there. I meant every word. Magnus chose to let me think he was dead, chose to manipulate me into this marriage for his own purposes. Whatever we had is over, done. And what we have? What we have is real, built on choice, not deception, on love, not convenience." She kissed him fiercely, putting all her conviction into the contact. "I'm not going anywhere, Haldor Eriksson. We're going to face this together, and we're going to win." As they walked back toward the village, toward the difficult task of preparing for battle, while wondering which of their neighbors might be plotting their destruction, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the cliff above. Elder Grim lowered his spyglass with a satisfied expression, then turned toward the path that would take him back to the village and to the message he needed to send before sunset. The game was entering its final phase, and all the pieces were exactly where they needed to be. The battle plans etched in stone would outlast them all, Haldor thought as he traced the carved lines with his finger. He and Brynja had worked through the night, using the flat surface of an ancient runestone to map out defensive positions, escape routes, and contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. The weight of leadership pressed down on him like chainmail, but for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying it alone. "The harbor approach is our weakest point," Brynja said, pointing to the narrow channel that represented their villages. "Greatest vulnerability. If they land there with full force, we can't hold the docks." "But we don't need to hold them," Haldor replied, his mind working through possibilities they discussed until dawn. "We need to funnel them into a killing ground." Around them, the great hall buzzed with desperate preparation. Village women sharpened kitchen knives and hunting blades, while men who'd never held weapons more dangerous than farming tools tried to master the basics of sword and spear. It was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Ordinary people preparing to fight for their homes with whatever courage they could muster. "The children?" Elder Grim asked, approaching their planning table with the careful step of a man trying to shoulder burdens that grew heavier each year. "Hidden in the old mine shaft, with Astrid and the other elders too frail to fight," Brynja answered without looking up from their carved strategies. "Food and water for 3 days, blocked passages that can be sealed if necessary." "And if we fail?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Both warriors looked up from their planning, meeting the old man's eyes with the honesty he deserved. "If we fail," Haldor said quietly, "they have instructions to seal themselves in and wait for rescue from the inland settlements. Bjorn's son knows the way through the mountain passes." It wasn't much comfort, but it was all they could offer. In warfare, especially when facing overwhelming odds, hope was a luxury that had to be rationed carefully. "Elder Grim," Brynja said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of testing that made Haldor glance at her sharply. Your message to the coastal settlements. When will they arrive to help us? What message? Grim's confusion seemed genuine, but something flickered in his eyes that made both warriors tense. I sent no messages. We decided it was too dangerous to weaken our neighbor's defenses. The lie was smoothly delivered, but Brynja had been watching for it. She and Haldor had discussed their suspicions during the long night of planning, identifying which villagers had accessed information, opportunity to communicate with outside forces, and motive to betray them. Of course, Brynja said mildly. I must have misremembered. But Haldor caught the subtle signal, a hand position they'd worked out to indicate confirmed suspicion. Elder Grim, the man who'd arranged their marriage, who'd known Haldor's location for years, who had access to every aspect of village defense, was the traitor Grimjo had spoken of. The knowledge sat in Haldor's stomach like cold iron. This man had been more than leader, he'd been like a father, offering guidance and acceptance when Haldor had first arrived broken and seeking redemption. To learn that it had all been performance, manipulation in service of a longer game, was almost worse than the physical danger they faced. I should check on the eastern watchtowers, Grim said, turning to leave. Make sure our sentries are properly positioned. Good idea, Haldor agreed, his voice carefully neutral. We'll finish here and join you shortly. As soon as the elder was out of earshot, Brynja leaned close. How long do you think he's been working with them? Years. Probably since before I arrived. The betrayal tasted bitter as wormwood. Grimjo likes his schemes elaborate. He'd probably placed Grim here generations ago, waiting for the right moment to use him. What do we do? It was a question that cut to the heart of leadership in wartime. Grim still commanded respect and loyalty from most of the villagers. Accusing him, without absolute proof, would shatter morale at the worst possible moment. But leaving him free to sabotage their defenses was equally dangerous. We watch him, Haldor decided. And we make sure our real plans stay between us. The stone carvings? False information? Let him report that we're planning to defend the harbor directly. Haldor's smile was sharp as a blade. Meanwhile, we prepare our actual strategy. Their real plan was simpler and more dangerous than what they'd carved in stone. Instead of trying to repel a superior force, they would allow Grimjaw's warriors to land and advance into the village. Then, using knowledge of every alley and building that came from years of peaceful residence, they would turn their home into a trap. It's a risk, Brynja said, understanding the implications immediately. If we miscalculate, they'll be among the houses where people live. If we try to meet them at the beach, they'll slaughter us in open combat. Haldor's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Better to make them fight on our terms, in terrain we know better than they do. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Young Leaf appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement and fear in equal measure. Ships, he called. 3 more longships approaching from the north. Haldor felt his heart sink. Reinforcements for Grimjaw would tip odds that were already impossible. But Brynja was studying the boy's expression with sharp attention. What colors do they fly? She asked. Red and gold, Leaf replied, confusion evident in his voice. Same as the ship that brought you here, Brynja. The silence that followed was profound. Red and gold, the colors of Brynja's birth clan, the Einburn of the Eastern Isles. But that made no sense unless my father. Brynja breathed, understanding flooding her features. He must have received word somehow. Can we trust them? Haldor asked. In warfare, the arrival of unexpected allies could be salvation or catastrophe, depending on whose side they actually fought for. Thorion's side may be many things, but he's no ally of mercenaries and oathbreakers. Brynja's smile was fierce. If my father's here, it's because he learned his daughter was in danger. The confirmation came within the hour. A messenger bearing Thor Ironside's personal banner arrived under flag of truce, bringing word that struck fear into their enemies and hope into their hearts. Lord Thor comes with 60 warriors, the messenger announced to the assembled village. He says any man who threatens his daughter will answer to him personally, and he's brought friends to make sure the message is clearly received. Brynja's response was swift and telling. Instead of pressing his advantage while he still had it, he withdrew his ships to deeper water, clearly reconsidering his timeline and tactics. The arrival of unexpected opposition had turned what should have been a simple slaughter into a more complex battle. "He'll attack tonight," Haldor predicted as they watched the enemy ships move to new positions. "Before your father can land and coordinate with us. Then we need to be ready." Brynja's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of partners who'd learned to find strength in unity. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," he agreed, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "No matter what the cost." As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, the village transformed into something between a fortress and a trap. Weapons were distributed to every person capable of holding them. Barricades were erected in carefully chosen positions. Fires were prepared that could be lit to provide light or signal for help. But more than the physical preparations, it was the spirit of the place that had changed. These people, farmers and fishers, craftsmen and merchants, had found something worth fighting for in the bonds they built with each other. They might die tonight, but they would die as a community, standing together against those who would tear down what they'd spent years building. "Are you ready?" Brynja asked as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. Haldor looked around the great hall one last time, memorizing faces he might never see again. His gaze lingered on Elder Grimm, who stood with the other villages preparing for battle, his betrayal hidden beneath decades of practiced deception. Soon, all masks would fall away. Soon, they would learn what each of them was truly made of. "I'm ready," he said, meaning it completely. The Battle of Raven's Hollow was about to begin. The warhorn's deep voice echoed across the fjord like the call of some ancient sea monster, summoning warriors to battle as their ancestors had for countless generations. Brynja stood on the village's highest point, her horn raised to her lips, the bronze instrument's haunting cry carrying both warning and defiance across the water. Below, Grimjaw's ships cut through the darkening waves with predatory grace. "There, coming fast," Haldor observed, joining her at the watchtower. His father's sword hung at his side, its familiar weight both comforting and ominous. 3 ships, full crews, maybe 60 warriors total, against our 23. Brynja lowered the horn, her pale eyes calculating odds that would have discouraged most commanders. Plus whatever my father brings when he lands, if he lands in time. The truth of it hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thor Ironside's ships were still leagues away, and night battles favored attackers who could choose their moment and direction. They might face Grimjaw's full force alone, at least initially. "The villagers are in position?" Brynja asked, though she knew the answer. They'd spent the afternoon checking and rechecking every defensive post, every escape route, every contingency they could imagine, hidden and ready. Bjorn has the eastern approach, Olaf guards the northern path. The women and children are secure. In the mines. Haldor's voice carried the weight of command, but she could hear the underlying tension. These weren't trained soldiers following orders. They were neighbors and friends risking everything to protect their home. The first longship scraped against the dock with a sound like grinding teeth. Torches flared to life among the attacking force, turning their advance into a river of flame flowing up from the harbor. Brynja counted silhouettes against the firelight, 40 warriors at least, moving with the disciplined precision of men who'd fought together for years. "Remember the plan," Haldor said quietly. Let them come into the village proper before we spring the trap. It went against every warrior instinct to allow enemies to advance unopposed. But their strategy depended on drawing Grimjaw's force into terrain, where superior numbers mattered less than knowledge of ground. The narrow streets and familiar buildings of Ravenshollow would become weapons in themselves. "Haldor!" A voice called from below Elder Grim, approaching with urgent steps. "The eastern watchtowers report movement. More ships coming from that direction." Both warriors tensed. Additional enemies would shatter their careful calculations, turn a desperate gamble into certain disaster. "How many?" Brynja demanded. "2 longships, flying unknown banners." Grim's voice carried just the right note of worried confusion, but both warriors now recognized the performance for what it was. "They'll cut off any retreat through the mountain passes." "Thank you for the warning," Haldor said carefully. "We'll adjust our defenses accordingly." As Grim hurried away to spread the alarming news, Brynja caught Haldor's eye. The traitor was still playing his role, feeding them information designed to demoralize and confuse. But his presence also provided an opportunity. "Let him think we're panicking," she murmured. "It might give us an edge when the real fighting starts." The sound of boots on stone announced the enemy's advance into the village proper. Grimjaw's warriors moved with practiced caution, shields raised and weapons ready, but they couldn't know every shadow and alley that Ravenshallow's defenders had spent years learning. What looked like empty streets to the attackers concealed carefully positioned villagers armed with determination and desperation. "Now," Haldor whispered, and the signal fire blazed to life on the watchtower. The battle erupted with shocking suddenness. Arrows flew from hidden positions, taking down the lead warriors before they could raise the alarm. Villagers emerged from concealment with weapons ranging from ancient swords to sharpened farming tools, striking at the flanks of the advancing column before melting back into the maze of buildings. Brynja leaped from the watchtower to the roof of the smithy, her shield catching a spear thrown by a quick-thinking enemy warrior. She rolled with the impact and came up running, using the rooftops as highways that let her strike where needed most. Below, Haldor led the main defensive line, his father's sword singing as it met enemy steel. For precious myths, their plan worked perfectly. Grimjaw's warriors found themselves fighting multiple opponents in confined spaces where their numerical advantage meant little. But these were experienced fighters, and they adapted quickly to the new conditions. "Fall back to secondary positions," Haldor called, his voice carrying over the clash of metal and screams of wounded men. The first phase of their defense had cost the enemy perhaps a dozen warriors, but it couldn't hold indefinitely. Brynja dropped from a roof into the midst of 3 enemy fighters, her sword taking one before the others could react. But as she engaged the survivors, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Magnus, advancing through the battle with the grim efficiency she remembered, heading directly toward where Haldor fought. "Behind you," she called, but her warning was lost in the noise of combat. Magnus struck like a viper, his blade seeking the gap between Haldor's ribs with lethal precision. Only ingrained reflexes saved Brynja's husband, twisting aside at the last instant, so that what should have been a killing blow opened a long cut across his shoulder instead. "Hello, Wolf," Magnus said, settling into a fighting stance with the casual confidence of a master facing a student. Time to pay for old sins. The 2 men circled each other while chaos raged around them, each seeking advantage in the deadly dance of single combat. Magnus had size and reach, but Haldor fought with the desperate intensity of a man protecting everything he loved. "Clever plan, using the village as a trap," Magnus continued, his sword probing for openings. "But did you really think we hadn't considered that possibility?" His meaning became clear as horn calls echoed from the eastern approach. The ships Grim had reported weren't additional enemies. They were Grimjaw's reserve force, landing behind the village's defenses to cut off retreat and strike at their weakest point. Brynja found herself fighting a running battle through streets. She'd walked peacefully just hours before. Every doorway might conceal an enemy. Every shadow could hide death. But this was her home now. These people her family by choice, if not blood. And she fought with the fury of someone defending the irreplaceable. Crossbow bolt took down young Leaf as he tried to carry messages between defensive positions. Brynja saw him fall and fought her way to his side, her shield deflecting the weapons of two warriors who tried to prevent her rescue. The boy was alive but bleeding badly, his face pale with shock and pain. "Can you move?" she asked urgently. "I think so," he gasped. But Brynja Elder grim, I saw him. Whatever he'd been about to say was lost as enemy warriors pressed their attack. Brynja slung the wounded boy over her shoulder and fought her way toward the great hall, where the most defensible position awaited. But with each step, it became clear that their careful plan was unraveling. The enemy had too many warriors, too much experience, too many advantages. One by one, Ravenshallow's defenders were being overwhelmed, despite their courage and determination. Soon, unless something changed dramatically, the battle would be over and the village would burn. Across the square, Haldor still dueled with Magnus, both men bearing wounds but neither giving ground. Their fight had taken on symbolic weight past against present, old love against new. The question of whether redemption was possible or whether some sins could never be forgiven. But Brynja could see that Haldor was tiring, his movements becoming slightly less precise with each exchange. Magnus was the younger man, fighting with the controlled aggression of someone who'd never learned to doubt his own righteousness. "The horn," young Leaf whispered as she set him down behind the dubious shelter of an overturned cart. "Blow the horn again. Signal for help." She looked toward the watchtower where her war horn waited, then at the battle raging around them. It was a long way through enemy-controlled ground, and there was no guarantee anyone would hear or respond to the call, but it was their only remaining hope. "Stay down," she told Leaf, then began fighting her way back toward the tower, her shield deflecting blows that would have killed a less skilled warrior. Each step was bought with blood and determination, but she climbed toward the horn that might summon salvation, or simply announce their final defeat to the uncaring stars above. The wedding ring Haldor had forged in the hours before battle caught. The firelight as his fist connected with Magnus's jaw, sending the younger man staggering backward. Blood ran down both their faces, mixing with sweat and grime until they looked like warriors from the old stories, mythic figures battling for the fate of the world. Still fighting for her? Magnus spat, wiping blood from his split lip. "She was mine first, Wolf. Mine by right and custom." "She was never yours," Haldor replied, his breathing labored but his grip on his father's sword still firm. "She was your partner, your companion in war, but you never understood the difference between possession and love." Above them, Brynja's horn sounded again across the fjord. 3 long blasts that echoed off the cliffs, like the voice of the gods themselves. In the distance, answering horns replied, and the night sky began to flicker with the torches of approaching ships. Magnus's face twisted with rage and something that might have been despair. "It doesn't matter now. Even if Thor Ironside arrives, it will be too late. The village burns, your people die, and you." He lunged forward with desperate fury, his blade seeking Haldor's heart. But Haldor was no longer the man who'd arrived. In Ravenshollow 10 years ago, broken by guilt and seeking only to hide from his past, he was someone who'd learned to love again, to hope again, to fight not for glory or gold, but for the precious things that made life worth living. His counterattack was perfectly timed, his father's sword finding the gap in Magnus's guard with surgical precision. Magnus staggered, looking down at the steel buried in his chest with surprise rather than pain. "You were always the better swordsman," he said quietly. "I just never wanted to admit it." "You were a good man, Magnus," Haldor replied, supporting his former rival as he sank to his knees. "But you chose the wrong side in the end. Did I?" Magnus's voice was growing weak, but his eyes remained clear. "Or did I just choose the only side that would have me after she chose you?" The question hung between them as Magnus died, carrying his jealousy and pain into whatever realm awaited fallen warriors. Haldor closed the dead man's eyes gently, according him the respect due to a worthy opponent, then looked around for the next threat. The battle had shifted dramatically in the past few minutes. Grimjaw's forces, sensing victory within their grasp, had pressed their attack with renewed vigor. But the arrival of reinforcements from the sea was changing the equation faster than most of the combatants realized. "Haldor," Brynja's voice called from the watchtower. "My father's landing at the North Beach 60 warriors, full battle gear." The news rippled through both armies like wildfire. Grimjaw's men, who moments before had been confident of victory, suddenly found themselves caught between the anvil of village defenses and the hammer of fresh troops. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical reality. But Grimjaw himself was nowhere to be seen among his fleeing warriors. Haldor scanned the battlefield with growing unease, knowing that the mercenary leader wasn't the type to abandon a profitable enterprise simply because the odds had shifted. His answer came in the form of smoke rising from the direction of the mines where the village's children and elders had taken shelter. Grimjaw, with a handful of his most loyal fighters, had circled around the main battle to strike at the most vulnerable members of the community, the leverage that would force Raven's Hollow's defenders to surrender despite their numerical recovery. "The mines!" Haldor shouted, but his warning was almost drowned out by the sound of collapsing timber. Grimjaw had set fires at the entrance, trapping the innocents inside while smoke slowly choked the life from them. Brynja rappelled down from the watchtower with reckless speed, landing beside him with her face set in grim determination. "How many men does he have with him?" 6, maybe 8. But they're positioned to control the only way in or out. Haldor's mind raced through possibilities, discarding plan after plan as too slow or too risky. If we assault directly, he'll kill the hostages before we can reach them. Then we don't assault directly. Brynja's smile was sharp as winter ice. "You know another way into those mines. The old ventilation shaft that connects to your workshop." She was right. The ancient mining tunnels had multiple access points, most of them forgotten or considered too dangerous for regular use. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "It's a 50-foot climb down unstable rock," Haldor warned. "And we'll have to do it in the dark, with Grimjaw's men potentially waiting at the bottom. Better than watching children suffocate while we debate safer options." They ran through streets littered with the debris of battle, past wounded warriors from both sides who would have to tend themselves while more urgent business demanded attention. Thor Ironside's men were efficiently mopping up the remaining resistance, but they were too far away to help with the crisis at the mines. The ventilation shaft was exactly as treacherous as Haldor had remembered, a narrow chimney through solid rock that dropped into darkness, thick enough to touch. He went first, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it, while Brynja followed close behind. "I can hear voices," she whispered as they descended. Grimjaw is giving orders about the smoke. They dropped a final 10 feet into a side passage that connected to the main mine shaft, landing with careful silence on stone worn smooth by generations of miners. The air was thick with smoke, but they could hear crying children and the reassuring voices of adults trying to keep them calm despite their own terror. This way, Haldor breathed, leading them through passages he'd explored during his early years in the village. The layout was burned into his memory from countless quiet walks when sleep had been elusive. and solitude preferable to the nightmares that plagued his rest. They emerged into the main chamber to find exactly what they'd expected and feared. Brynja stood with his remaining men around a fire that sent thick smoke toward the sealed entrance where 40 villagers huddled together, some already unconscious from the poisonous air. "Touching," Grimjaw said without turning around. "The wolf comes to save his sheep. But you're too late, they're already dying, and you're outnumbered." "Are we?" Brynja asked mildly, and stepped into the firelight with her sword drawn and her shield ready. What followed was the kind of desperate, close-quarters fighting that separated warriors from soldiers, survivors from heroes. In the confined space of the mine shaft, with innocent lives hanging in the balance, there was no room for elaborate tactics or careful maneuvering. There was only the need to kill quickly and efficiently before smoke claimed the people they'd sworn to protect. Haldor fought with his father's sword singing in his hands, each stroke economical and deadly. Beside him, Brynja moved like a force of nature, her blade finding vital targets with mechanical precision. Together, they carved through Grimjaw's guards with the terrible efficiency of partners who trusted each other completely. But Grimjaw himself was still the warrior who'd earned his fearsome reputation through years of successful brutality. When his men fell around him, he came at the married couple with the fury of someone who knew this was his last chance for the revenge that had consumed half his life. "You destroyed everything I built," he snarled, his sword weaving patterns of death in the smoky air. "My reputation, my crew, my place in the world, all because you suddenly developed a conscience. Your reputation was built on the blood of innocents," Haldor replied, parrying a strike that would have opened his throat. "If my conscience destroyed that, then it was work worth doing." The final exchange lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Grimjaw's blade swept toward Brynja's unprotected side, while Haldor was engaged with another attacker. Time seemed to slow as steel approached flesh, as one small mistake threatened to unravel everything they'd fought to protect. But Brynja had not survived 2 husbands and countless battles by being unprepared for such moments. She twisted with liquid grace, letting Grimjaw's sword pass harmlessly by while her own blade found the gap beneath his raised arm. The mercenary leader's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been respect before the light faded from them forever. "Is it over?" asked a small voice from the shadow's little Sigrid, Astrid's granddaughter, peering out from behind the protective circle of adults. "It's over," Brynja confirmed, though she kept her sword ready until they were certain no other threats remained. "The bad men are gone." Haldor was already working to clear the blocked entrance, his hands sure despite the smoke that still burned his eyes and throat. One by one, the villagers emerged into clean air and starlight, children crying with relief, while their elders offered prayers of thanksgiving to whatever gods had seen them through the darkness. As dawn broke over Ravenshollow, the scope of their victory became clear. Grimjaw's force was scattered or dead. The village's defenders were bloodied but alive, and Thor Ironside's reinforcements had arrived in time to ensure that no enemy escaped to threaten them again. But for Haldor, the most important sight was Brynja standing in their doorway, silhouetted against the growing light with her copper hair catching the early sun. She was alive, unharmed, and still choosing to build a life with him despite everything they'd endured. The ring on his finger forged. In the shadow of battle, worn through the crucible of combat, felt lighter now, blessed by fire and consecrated by shared survival. They had fought for their love and won it, earned the right to whatever peaceful years the gods might grant them. The memorial stone stood where the watchtower had been, its surface carved with the names of those who'd fallen defending Ravenshollow. Haldor ran his fingers over the runes, feeling the weight of memory and the promise of remembrance in each carefully etched line. 3 villagers had died in the battle, brave souls who'd chosen to stand rather than flee, whose sacrifice had purchased safety for their children and grandchildren. It's beautiful work, Brynja said, joining him in the morning light that painted the fjord gold and silver. 6 months had passed since the battle, long enough for wounds to heal and new routines to establish themselves, but the stone remained a daily reminder of what they'd fought to preserve. Thor Ironside's stonemason did the carving, Haldor replied. But the words came from the village. Everyone wanted their stories told properly. Brynja's father had stayed for 2 months after the battle, ostensibly to ensure no other threats emerged, but really to get to know the man his daughter had chosen to marry. The gruff warrior had been skeptical at first. What father wouldn't be, when his daughter's husband was a decade older and carried the baggage of a violent past? But time had worked its subtle magic, and Thor had departed with genuine respect for the life his daughter had built. Your father's letter arrived yesterday, Haldor said, producing a piece of parchment sealed with the Ironside clan mark. He wants to know if we've reconsidered his offer to return to the Eastern Isles. And have we? Brynja's tone was carefully neutral, though they discussed the possibility many times since Thor's visit. Have we? Haldor turned the question back to her. The Ironside lands would offer security, wealth, and status that Ravenshollow could never match. Thor had made it clear that his daughter and her husband would be welcomed as honored members of the clan, with lands and responsibilities commensurate with their proven abilities. I think, Brynja said slowly, that some gifts are too precious to accept. She gestured toward the village below them, where life had resumed its peaceful rhythm. Bjorn mended nets by the harbor, while his children played at being warriors. Astrid tended her loom with the methodical care of someone who understood that beautiful things required patience. In the forge that had been rebuilt after the battle, young apprentices learned the blacksmith's trade under masters who valued both skill and character. This is home now, Brynja continued. Not because it's safe, we know how quickly that can change, but because it's ours. We've bled for it, built it, chosen it over easier alternatives. Haldor nodded, understanding completely. He'd spent 10 years in Ravenshollow before the battle, but it was only in fighting for the village that he truly claimed it as his own. The difference between residing somewhere and belonging somewhere was written in sweat and sacrifice, in the choice to stand when running would be wiser. Elder Grimm's replacement arrived this morning, he said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. The revelation of Grimm's betrayal had shaken the village deeply, creating questions about trust and leadership that had taken months to resolve. What's she like? Young for the position, but Thor recommended her personally. Astrid the Wise. They call her not our Astrid, but a distant cousin who served as arbitrator for clan disputes throughout the Eastern Isles. Haldor's smile held approval. She listened to our account of recent events for 3 hours without interrupting, then asked exactly the right questions to understand what kind of community we're trying to build here. Good. We need someone who sees leadership as service rather than privilege. They walked down from the memorial stone toward their home, noting the changes that 6 months of peace had brought. New houses were under construction to replace those damaged in the battle. The harbor had been expanded to accommodate the fishing fleet that Thor's gift of 3 new boats had made possible. Gardens flourished with late summer growth, tended by people who'd learned not to take such simple abundance for granted. I have news, Brynja said as they reached their door. Her tone carried a note that made Haldor look at her more carefully, noting the particular quality of her smile. What kind of news? The kind that changes everything again. She took his, hands in hers, studying his face with an expression he'd never seen before, hope mixed with vulnerability, excitement tempered by uncertainty. I'm with child, Haldor. We're going to have a family. The words hit him like a physical blow, driving all other thoughts from his mind. A child. Their child. The continuation of bloodlines he'd thought ended. The promise of a future that stretched beyond their own mortal years. Are you certain? Astrid, Our Astrid confirmed it yesterday. The signs are unmistakable. Brynja's voice carried wonder at the reality of it. I know we never discussed it, never planned for it. At our ages, with our histories. It's a gift, Haldor interrupted, pulling her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. An unexpected, impossible, precious gift. They held each other in the doorway of their home, thinking of all the paths that had led them to this moment. His years of exile and redemption. Her losses and survival. The arrangement that had become. Genuine love. The battle that had tested everything they'd built together. All of it had been necessary, somehow, to bring them to this place where new life could grow. I'm frightened, Brynja admitted quietly. I've never been responsible for anything so fragile. You've protected an entire village. You've saved lives with your courage and wisdom. You'll be a wonderful mother. Haldor's voice carried absolute conviction. And you won't be doing it alone. No, she agreed, her smile returning. We'll do it together. All of it, the sleepless nights, the worry, the joy of watching someone new discover the world. That evening, they announced their news to the village during the weekly gathering in the Great Hall. The response was everything they could have. Hoped for cheers and congratulations, offers of help and advice. The warm embrace of a community celebrating new hope. The first child born to Raven's Hollow's heroes, someone called out, raising a cup of mead in salute. To the future, others echoed, and the toast was taken up throughout the hall. Later, as they prepared for bed in the home they'd defended and the life they'd chosen, Brynja traced lazy patterns on Haldor's chest while he held her close. Do you think our child will be a warrior? She asked. I think our child will be whatever they choose to be, Haldor replied. Warrior or farmer, leader or follower, adventurer or homebody. We'll teach them to be strong and kind, to value both courage and compassion, to understand that the greatest victories are often won without drawing a sword. And if danger comes again, if our peaceful life is threatened, then we'll stand together as we always have. We'll protect what matters and face whatever comes with the strength we've found in each other. His hand moved to rest on her still flat belly, marveling at the life growing there. But I have hope, Brynja. Real hope for the first time in years. I think this child will grow up in a world where peace is possible, where love is valued more than conquest, where the old cycles of violence might finally be broken. Outside their window, the memorial stone stood sentinel in the moonlight, its carved names a reminder of the price of peace. But around it, the village slept safely, protected by the love that had grown from duty into something transcendent, something worth preserving for generations yet to come. In the months that followed, as Brynja's pregnancy progressed and the village prepared for its newest member, the story of the loner Viking and his warrior bride became legend. Travelers carried the tale to distant lands, where it was told and retold around countless hearths, the story of two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other, who'd fought for love and won the right to build something beautiful from the ashes of their past. But for Haldor and Brynja, the real reward wasn't legend or fame. It was the simple, extraordinary miracle of ordinary days, sunrise over the fjord, shared work and shared laughter, the promise of new life and the hope of years yet to be lived in peace and love, and gratitude for all they'd been given. The loner Viking had found his home at last, and his Shieldmaiden bride had found hers beside him.